Thanks everyone for joining. I know I'm the last thing between you and beer and wine, so no pressure for me whatsoever. We're going to be talking about something called Innersource. So just out of curiosity, who's heard the term before? Okay, a fair few hands. Okay, so maybe 20, 30% for those on camera, or online, sorry. So who's ever worked in an organization that looks something like this? Seeing a few gentle hands slowly raising. I'm going to be doing a lot of audience participation, by the way, so keeping you all awake. Organizational silos is something so common that we see in many organizations today. And it's not necessarily by design. No one comes along and says, do you know what we're going to do? We're going to start making these different teams that maybe they don't interact with each other so much. And actually, this is a real problem, because when you think about these organizational silos, what that is doing is that is preventing these different organizations from working together. Because I don't know if anyone's heard of Conway's Law, but the idea that we ship software based upon the state of our organizational structure. So what happens? We start shipping a shopping cart, we start shipping a catalog, we start shipping, etc., etc., etc. And rather than bringing all of those teams together and thinking about innovation, we start getting these silos emerge where we just focus on that specific project. So organizations are working in silo. And the challenge with this is that it then prevents this collaboration, not just internally within our own engineering teams, but actually, when you think about it, how you actually work with the outside world as well, because open source is a big part of what we all do day to day. I'd probably hedge a bet that the majority of the applications that everyone's writing today has some kind of open source in it, some dependency that you're relying upon. So actually, if you're siloed within your organization, are you potentially limiting yourselves in terms of what you can do externally as well? So Innersource, we had probably 20% of the hands up in the room here. To talk about Innersource, we first need to start somewhere else. So another show of hands. Who's heard of open source before? There we go. So about 95% hands in the room. Good. And just out of curiosity, any open source contributors in the room? Probably 10 hands or so. Awesome. Thank you for the work for the rest of us in the room as well, and being able to build upon your excellent work. Thank you. For anyone who's not familiar with open source, it's this idea that we're building for a common good, that we're coming together as a community, that we're building software for the greater good. But when you think about open source communities, there's actually something really interesting. Think about what we've just talked about with silos. You can't work together necessarily, or it requires some effort. But actually, open source communities, the clue is in the name, open. They work openly with each other. They're not co-located in a single office, in a single building. They don't have daily or weekly stand-ups necessarily. They're global. They're asynchronous. They're remote. They work in this way that actually they foster this collaboration by default. It's open by default. So when you think about some of those principles and some of those ideas, couldn't we potentially bring those back into what we do in our internal development day to day? So this definition here is actually from the Innersource Commons. So Innersource is just, quite simply, the use of open source methods and strategies inside your proprietary company to produce software. So what we're saying is, let's take all of that goodness that we've learned from open source communities and instead use that to our advantage internally. Now, I'm not saying you suddenly need to open your code to the entire world. That is not what I'm suggesting here at all. But actually, when you think about the default inside your organization, are you able to see what another team is working on across the organization? Are you able to contribute into what that other team is working on? Is that other team able to contribute into what you're working on? And this is the idea of Innersource, is actually we're building this community up around our internal development. So we're removing those silos and we're starting to think about some of those practices and patterns in what we do day to day. Now, actually, when we look at the concepts, there's nothing too surprising. Fundamentally, it starts with visibility. So the idea is that actually you want those repositories, those projects, those pieces of work that those teams are working on to be open. And again, when I say open, I mean within the confines of the organization. I'm not saying you suddenly open source everything that you're working on, but you then allow that visibility across the organization. Because as soon as it's visible, I can start understanding where maybe there's duplication. Because if we're working in those silos, and let's say I'm on the shopping cart team and we need to define a package to process orders, for example, maybe another team has already defined that. And I didn't know because they're working in silo. I can't see what they're doing. They can't see what we're doing. And we can't work together effectively for the greater good of the organization, for the greater good of the company. So we're translating those practices that we've talked about from an open source perspective and bringing them inside the confines of where we work. So visibility is the first part, but then forking and branching. So being able to take that copy of that production code base and have your own version of that. So whether that's a fork, whether that's a branch, depends on your current setup and how that's all working. But then if I, as a developer, or anyone in this room as a developer, decided they wanted to contribute onto my project, make a copy, then go on to the next piece, make a pull request, right? All of these topics, all of these ideas that we're talking about here are so well known because guess what? The majority of us are probably doing these on GitHub already or in another tool day to day that guess what? That's kind of how we contribute. That's already how we work. But it's bringing those practices not just to our own project, but to projects across the organization and changing that culture. So because we're using pull requests, guess what? We then get testing capabilities, we get CI, we get CD. So when you think about all of these concepts that we've learned from a DevOps perspective, all these good practices, they then start applying to no matter which team you are inside the organization. Because if I'm on that shopping cart team and I want to go and make a contribution to the catalog, for example, it doesn't matter if I'm in that team, if I'm in another team, if I'm whoever, I still have to follow the same rules. I still have to make a pull request. If you've got policies set up, then guess what? I have to get a passing build. I have to get passing tests. I have to go and make sure that my linting works, et cetera, et cetera. So instead of having these manual processes or these kind of, synchronous working together and figuring out requirements and passing requirements between teams, wouldn't it be another way that I could just directly contribute into that myself? Because the beauty of this Innersource model is not necessarily that you're going to be getting a ton of new different contributions to your project. I'd love to say that you'd be able to, but I think Microsoft have actually put some stats out there that I think is like 5 to 10% across the organization. They see some of that. So you're not going to see a huge amount of contributions across. But what it starts giving you is this visibility across these different teams. Issues, documentation, these are all different parts of that same kind of puzzle pieces that we're putting together. Because if I don't know how to contribute into another project, if I don't know what your standards are, if I don't know how you're going to work all together, I'm probably not going to want to contribute to your project. If there's no clear README, if there's no clear way of going through that process, I'm not really inclined or incentivized to actually go and contribute into your work. So the easier that we can actually make it to contribute into what you're working on, the more likely you're going to get those contributions. So a quick trivia quiz here. There's a big, big project that probably majority of the people in the room here know about that started off as an Innersource project from Microsoft. Does anyone happen to know what I might be thinking of here? Not Azure DevOps. Anyone happen to use a small editor? Who said that? Bingo. You need to come to our booth and grab some stickers or something. VS Code is exactly right. So Visual Studio Code, the editor that many of us know and love and that we use today, is actually open source. It started off as an Innersource project. There were many teams across Microsoft who were all kind of going in a similar direction, trying to build an editor for Azure DevOps, for Azure, for kind of local use as well. And rather than being competing teams and deciding to work on that project in separate ways, they came together across the company for the greater good, built what is known as the Monaco editor, which is the foundation of VS Code as you know it today. So it shows that actually these inner source projects can go from being this internal collaboration into these open source projects as well, if we so desire. So you probably get the vibe here that actually this is quite a big change, because suddenly we're no longer working in these kind of individual silos. We're no longer working on a project by project basis. Obviously, that's my main focus as a day-to-day. But if I depend on another team's work, I have the opportunity to contribute into what they're doing, or vice versa. So where on earth do we start? Because that is actually quite a substantial change. And you'd be right, it is quite a cultural change. I don't know if anyone's here is thinking, awesome, other people get to read my code in the organization. Yes, I'm so excited by that. I don't think anyone is thinking that at all, because we have this kind of protection, a defense that we feel about the code that we've written, right? So in our team, we're okay, we feel kind of cozy, but the rest of the organization, maybe a bit nervous there. But actually starting small and experimenting is really the first step. Just like anything, try it out. Figure out what those success criteria are going to be. What are the potential projects in your organization that are going to suit? Because where we've talked about this idea of visibility, it's not going to work for all projects. I know I'm here talking about Innersource and why you should do it, but actually it's not always going to be the right thing. You know, if you, let's say you're a defense organization and you've got top secret things that you don't want to share across the organization, probably a good reason not to. In some industries, maybe regulation, for example. But if you change the default to being visible, to being open, and then those silos are exception, you're changing that culture, you're changing the way that people think about contributing across the organization. But to start small, experiment, and expand from there. And this example that I've got on screen is actually from a community, an independent community called the Innersource Commons, and they've got a number of great patterns up on their site. This is just one of them. I think there's like a good 15 to 20 or so. If you haven't heard of them or seen them before, definitely recommend going and checking them out, because they've got some awesome stuff up on their site there. So that's the first part, is kind of starting small, experimenting, growing from there, learning from that, because I think there were a couple of folks I was speaking to earlier who were in the room that the challenge they had was convincing management. And that's often something I hear as a concern as well, is how you convince that organizational change. And that is exactly how. Second, make contributing easy. Make it so easy that as if you were having like a limbo bar, you know, that you're kind of trying to go under. Instead, you trip on it on the way in. You want to make it that simple that the bar is just so easy to get past. So the first part around that is how you go ahead and actually make contributing easy. Contributing doesn't necessarily mean code. It can mean raising bugs, raising feature requests, raising issues, etc. But if we're talking about code, then something like GitHub Codespaces or other tools are available, are able to help you do that. So if anyone's not aware, GitHub Codespaces is an ability where you can spin up a developer environment on demand. So actually at GitHub, what we used to do when we build GitHub on our local machines, the GitHub repo is about 82 gigabytes in size, if my memory is right. And we've got, I think, around 600 engineers working on it right now. That used to take us anything upwards of 4 hours to kind of bootstrap a laptop from scratch to getting GitHub working. And that was if you were lucky. If you weren't lucky, you'd have to go onto Slack, get someone to triage with you, etc., etc. It works on my machine. Yeah? So that's exactly the problem that we're trying to solve here. And now we've got this down to less than 10 seconds for GitHub. So it started off as 45 minutes when we started using Codespaces, now less than 10 seconds. Now think of that time down from 4 hours. Why am I talking about this? Because actually, if you think about Innersource, there's no guarantee you're all using the same tools. There's no guarantee you're using the same frameworks, the same languages, the same developer tooling. So if you can start standardizing on some declarative, templatized way of spinning up your development environments, then that's going to help enable that cross-contribution across the organization as well. So this is one of the ways you make contributing easier. The other, have to give an obligatory mention, of course, is our friend GitHub Copilot. Has anyone used GitHub Copilot yet at all? A couple of hands. And heard of GitHub Copilot? A few more hands, okay. So think of ChatGPT and what it's done in terms of conversational tasks and being able to interact. Think of GitHub Copilot as a similar tool, but for coding. So rather than having to, when I'm writing regular expression, go out to regex 101 or whatever website I try and generate my regular expressions from, or looking up documentation or looking up boilerplate code and how to do things. Instead, I've got that tool within my editor to help me stay in the flow, to help me maintain what I am doing. And actually, I'm not going to go in tons of depth here on Copilot, but there's some really fascinating stats which are all available on our blog. From 2,000 developers, 96% of them saying they're faster with repetitive tasks, 88% are more productive, 74% focusing on more satisfying work. Again, why am I focusing on this? Because if you think about that idea of collaborating across the organization, you're not going to know the ins and outs of the other team's code base. You might not even be familiar with that language. But if you're able to use tools like Codespaces to help you accelerate your development environment setup time and Copilot to help you code, that helps make those contributions even easier. Now, the fun part that every developer loves, documentation. Now, we're not thinking about documentation from the end user perspective. Whilst it is absolutely important, what I'm talking about here is how you enable other teams, other developers inside the organization to contribute to what you do, to contribute to your project. Because again, if I don't understand the context of the project, what is it? Is it a business critical system? Is it a library which is underpinning 80% of what the organization does? If I don't understand what it is and maybe the value for me, I'm either going to decide, right, that project isn't relevant for me. I'm making my own project which does what I need it to do. Or actually that project does what I need and we shouldn't reinvent the wheel. We should go ahead and invest in this and help this team out because they're building something awesome that the rest of the organization can use. So it comes back to that idea from earlier, this visibility idea, that actually visibility is one thing, but I need to understand what these different projects are, what these components are, and be able to almost self-serve in that scenario. So why does it exist? Who maintains it? What are the standards? And how do I contribute? Are some of the common questions you might want to think about. And then quality checks. So again, we talked about things like unit testing, CI/CD, etc. And hopefully these are all terms that you're thinking, okay, yep, we're doing these things already. But when you think about it in the context of this broader organization working together, we're starting to eliminate those kind of manual touch points, those points where they require some synchronous work between teams. Instead, you're allowing automation to just naturally take its course. You're enabling people to just make a pull request, to contribute into the project, and it doesn't matter if I'm in the host team. So if I'm part of the team that is actually going ahead and making that project versus a contributor elsewhere across the organization, it doesn't matter who I am. I have to follow the same standards as anyone else. So it becomes a gate, it becomes a quality gate. So then when we think about shipping to production, that is a very clear line, no matter who you are, whether you're part of the project team, whether you're part of an external contributing team. So again, have unit tests passed? Does it build? Is it accessible? Smoke tests? Are there no new security issues, for example? Again, security can just be part of that life cycle and be part of those checks as well. And then finally, embracing open ways of working. I talked a bit earlier about this idea of who's really excited to open up their code to other people inside the organization to go and look at. It can be really intimidating. It can be really kind of nerve-wracking. But actually, there's a lot of benefits. So the first thing is actually starting pull requests early. And that may sound a bit counterintuitive. Hold on, am I wasting someone's time? But actually, if you think about it, think about a pull request as an idea, as an expression of intent that, hey, I want to actually go and make this suggestion to your code base. Or maybe you've created an issue first. Either way, some kind of signal of intent of, I want to contribute this to your project. Better to do it early so the maintainer can say, that looks great. I think that's a great fit for the project. Let me know how I can help you bring that in. Versus you've done maybe weeks and weeks of work on this thing for a maintainer to say, sorry, that doesn't fit in this project. We can't accept that and we're not going to maintain that. Because then you've wasted time on kind of both fronts and probably created a bit of a political scenario then as well. So being able to do those pull requests early and often is a key part of that process. Code reviews and quality we've talked about in terms of the quality checks, but then communicating openly. And again, openly within the confines of the organization. So things like GitHub issues, things like discussions, AN other tools are available in similar means, but being able to document in a way that is open rather than in a closed Slack channel or direct messages or emails, being able to communicate openly then starts fostering that cultural change that you're looking for. So this is a super high level intro to Innersource and kind of why you want to think about it and some of the considerations. There's going to be another talk tomorrow by my colleague Senna, and she's going to go in a lot more depth in terms of the components to think about, some of the pieces from a GitHub perspective and how they work. A few of us will be around outside as well. We've got the booth there as well tomorrow. So if you've got any questions then, please do come along. But otherwise, appreciate you all being here and thank you very much.
Oh, we have a few minutes for questions. I think you had one.
Well, thank you for the presentation. It was great.
Sure.
One point I've noticed it here, you are actually involving the people to contribute. Mm-hmm. But what about the responsibility? That's mean I've made some change, mm-hmm. and it comes through the CI/CD pipelines. It comes through the pull request, but it's broken. Mm-hmm. It's a pattern like commit and run.
It's a great question. So just to make sure folks online could hear as well, I'll just kind of repeat. In terms of that collaboration, if you've got someone who's contributed as a guest into a project, what are the responsibilities effectively of the different parties? So the terms from an Innersource Commons perspective that they use is a host team and a guest team. So think of the host team as the maintainers of the project. The guest team, maybe a close neighboring team, maybe a team elsewhere across the organization. They both have different roles. So A, opening that pull request early, signaling the intent is an important part. But B, the host team, what they will do is they have this role of a trusted committer. And the idea of a trusted committer is that they also act as a coach. So it's not just kind of looking at every single pull request that comes in and going, sorry, that doesn't look good, and then kind of leaving it there. It's about, right, sorry, that doesn't look good, but actually what we need to accept that is A, B, C, and D. And if you need some help with that, let me know and we can work together on that. So it becomes much more of a collaborative effort than it is like, the example I normally give is like a center of excellence, from at least from my experience, what I've seen, is you get this like center of excellence team that almost becomes the bottleneck for all other teams in the organization. And guess what? If that team is getting requirements from everyone, whose requirements is most important? And that's the challenge, right? Whereas this collaborative model from an Innersource perspective then becomes a collaboration. So you're then having this trusted committer, not just working, you know, a certain percentage of their time on the actual implementation of the project, but actually they are then coaching others in the organization to go and contribute in as well. So it's very much a collaborative effort through that pull request. Does that help? Super. Awesome.
Anybody? Going once? Ah, yes.
In that sense, the Innersource will not substitute the DevOps practices, right?
Oh no, absolutely not. Absolutely not.
It's like a replacement or another alternative?
No, I'd say Innersource builds upon the DevOps practices. So if you think about all of those good things, like bringing those teams together, the fact that we're not kind of throwing things across the wall, those kind of ideas that we're so commonly used to now, it's very much the same piece that actually you're trying to completely get rid of those silos and actually encourage visibility across the organization. And when you think about, and I'm not going to get into the definition of DevOps here because I'm sure if I surveyed the room, we'd get many different definitions. But if you think about some of those practices as well, so like CI, CD, bringing testing in, quality in, shifting left, all of those pieces actually play a part of this Innersource model. So it's more about a way of working culturally and actually bringing down those silos to encourage collaboration across the organization. And those DevOps principles really underpin it. Yeah, super.
All right, I guess it's beer and wine time. Let's give Chris one more round of applause.
Thank you.